Hello YouTube, Dave here again. I'm back with another Pathfinder 2nd Edition playtest video, and today I'm going to be looking at the top 5 things that I really like so far about the Pathfinder playtest. I had considered doing just a full-on review of the Pathfinder playtest material, but honestly we're still pretty early on. We've only recently closed the second adventure's playtest period, and there's a lot of the playtest to go. So I'm going to hold off on doing the full review, but there are some things that I do really like about the system so far, and I thought I would talk about those in this video. And in the next video I'll talk about a few things that I would recommend as changes to the system. So without further ado, let's get right to it with number 5 of my top 5 favorite things about the playtest so far. We're going to be looking at character creation, and specifically we're going to be looking at the stat generating method for Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Alright, so number 5 on the list is the generating of ability scores for your characters, part of the character creation process, which I will say overall I really like the character creation system that Pathfinder 2nd Edition is shaping up to have. It is similar in some ways to the Starfinder method that I also really generally liked. So I've made videos about creating characters in the past, although I did forget one or two things along the line which were addressed in the comments, but I'm going to go over this in brief because I don't really feel like having to go into a great amount of detail. And I'm also going to be talking about the default method of character creation, not the optional system where you roll your stats. If you want to roll stats, that's perfectly fine, but there are some things to keep in mind, which I'll touch on a little bit later. So the way that stat generation works in the 2nd Edition Pathfinder is that all of your stats start at a base number of 10. 10 being the average ability score for any common person. Then upon having your base numbers, your choices in ancestry, which is the term that's been used to replace races. So you have ancestries, you have your background, and then you have your class itself that will affect your ability scores as you go. So starting with a base 10, you apply either boosts to your ability scores, which are a +2 bonus, or you apply a flaw, which is a -2 penalty. Most ancestries only have a single flaw, and I haven't really noticed any off the top of my head that have a secondary one. So for the most part, you're only going to be applying a single flaw, but you will get multiple boosts. Your ancestry will give you 2 set ability boosts. So these are ones that will always be the same. So for example, if you're making an elf character, I believe the boosts go to both dexterity and intelligence, if I recall correctly. So those would go from starting off at a base number of 10 to going up to 12, and then they have a flaw, which is their constitution, which would be reduced by 2, going from 10 to 8. Your ancestry will also give you a single ability boost that you can put wherever you wish. It can go into any ability score that you choose. Up next is your background, and backgrounds are essentially what you were before you became an adventurer. I'm not going to go into too many of the different types, but there are things like farmhands, and like the Doomsday Dawn campaign book has stuff like a goblin renegade and things like this. So these are essentially kind of what you were before you became a traveling hero. So with your background, you have a set ability boost that generally goes into one of 2 abilities. So you can usually choose between one or another, as well as getting another free boost that you can put into any stat that you choose. Up next, you finally have your class, and your class will give you a single ability boost to their primary score. So whatever ability that they use primarily for the class, most classes have it sort of set in stone. For example, wizards would always go into intelligence. I think clerics always go into wisdom, things along those lines. However, a couple of classes will actually give you a choice, such as the fighter, where your primary ability can be either strength or dexterity. So if you wanted to make a strength-based character that focuses on melee attacks, then you could do that with the fighter. Or you could also make one who's more focused on dexterity and like ranged attacks or finesse weapons. And you can kind of go from there as well. Finally, you will get 4 free ability boosts just for creating your character. Now, whenever you get multiple boosts from a single source, which in this case, in this example, making an elf character, the only time you would get multiple free ones is from creating a first level character. However, humans, I should note, also get a free ability boost as well. So, or multiple free, I think they get like 2 or 3 free ability boosts. So, if you get multiple free boosts from the same source, be it Ancestry or just for your starting character, they all have to go into separate abilities. If you gain them from different sources, so if you gain a free boost from your Ancestry, you can put it into, say, your strength stat. Then you get one for your background. You could also put that into your strength, and then you could get one of your free ones as well for just being a first level character. Can go into strength, but you can't take 3 of your 4 free boosts that you get from that source and put them all in the same stat. So in general, when you're assigning your ability scores, it's best to do it sort of step by step and assign the free boosts when you get them from the source that you get them from. It's a mistake that I made with the initial character, was that I just added all of them together. Ultimately, I don't think I messed up where I put the attributes, but it wasn't explained well because I just sort of lumped them all together, and that was a mistake on my part. But that system is something that, again, I really, really, really like. Now, you can roll stats as well. Doing so, you typically lose all of your free boosts, and you only get some of the ones that are set. That said, those set abilities, nothing can go beyond a score of 18. So even if you roll really, really well for your stats, you're not going to get anything above an 18. So it can result in potentially some wasted numbers depending. And if you had a 17 and you wanted to boost it, that boost could only put it up to 18 if you had like a boost from your Ancestry or class, for example. In general, I think that the default method is the way to go, and it's the system that I very, very much prefer. And it definitely does a much better job than some other version, like other role-playing games, point buy system, which tend to be needlessly complicated in terms of like buying abilities on like a one-for-one basis sort of thing. This one does an excellent job, and I really, really think that this is one of the best character creation systems that I have seen in a long time. So, with that being number 5, we're going to move right on to number 4, which is going to be Ancestry and Class Feats. So anyone who really knows me in terms of my thoughts on certain aspects of modern role-playing games, you may be surprised to see me mention feats on here at all. Honestly, feats were something that I got really burned out on by the time I finished running 3rd edition and 3.5 D&D. I just got really, really sick of them. That said, the way that feats are handled in the Pathfinder Playtest is something that I actually really, really like. Particularly, I really like the way that they do like Ancestry feats as well as class feats. So, in the past, your ancestry or race would give you just a list of abilities that you would get, and they would all be the same for each member of like the race. So if you had 2 characters playing a dwarf, for example, they both had all the same dwarven abilities, unless there was this like a sub race that they had chosen that was different. But if you just took ones out of the core book, then you generally had the exact same list of abilities, and you would get them all up front. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but when I saw the way that Ancestry feats were done in this game, it sort of made me realize that having some flexibility with these racial abilities was something that I didn't realize that I kind of like, or that I kind of wanted in my role-playing games. So, for example, we'll actually switch over just for a second to, say, the dwarf, if I can find them. So for example, the dwarves would always get things like, in the past, they would get all their abilities up front. So they would gain something like a bonus to saving throws versus magic or versus poison. They would get like a bonus to their armor class against giants, and maybe a bonus to attack rolls against some of their favorite enemies. They get stone cutting. They get all these things right up front. But it also made them feel kind of all the same, because like I said, if you had two people playing dwarves, they all had the same abilities. With this system, at first level, you choose one ancestry feat, and then you gain an ancestry feat every 4 levels after that. So 5, 9, 13, and 17, you gain an additional feat. And what this does is it allows you to customize your particular character from your particular ancestry. So for example, you could have a party of dwarves, first level dwarves, and it's very possible that no two of you would have the same ancestry feat, meaning that different dwarves from different backgrounds, for example, may have different starting abilities. One of the things that I like where stone cutting is one of the dwarven ancestry feats. It kind of reminds me of the Dragon Age world, where if a dwarf lives on the surface, they're said to have lost their stone sense. And you could actually reproduce that by just never taking the stone cutting feat for a dwarf in Pathfinder 2nd edition. So it's something that I actually really like, and it's a great way of, again, sort of being able to differentiate and customize your characters while not front loading them with all of their racial abilities. And that's something that I just really like the way that it's done. Another aspect of it that I really like, and something that I think opens the door quite a bit for future products, are for example, the human race has its own set of sub-lists of feats that you can take depending on if you want it to be a half-elf or a half-orc. So to be a half-elf or half-orc, you have to play a human, but then you choose the half-elf or the half-orc ancestry feats, and they in themselves really produce their own chain of things that you can take later on. So, but what it means is that you can mix and match your ancestry feats. So you have to take, in order to be a half-elf or a half-orc, you do have to take the ancestry feat at first level. That's like, you don't have a choice there. So in those regards, 2 half-elves and 2 half-orcs at first level are going to be pretty similar in terms of what their abilities are. But beyond that, whenever you gain an ancestry feat, you can choose to take one from your list of your half-elf or half-orc ancestry lists, or you could choose one from the human list. So you're not necessarily stuck with just the half-elf or half-orc. So you can really sort of mix and match that way. And that's a system that, again, I think is really well done, and something that I really like. Now, up next are the class feats. And so these are things that are specific to individual classes. So instead of having just this giant list of feats that, for the most part, anyone could take, they instead break them down by the classes that they were sort of designed for or work best for in the first place. So, for example, just looking at the fighter here, once I can get to the first level list of fighter abilities. So in the past, you'd have something like Power Attack, which was a feat that really anyone could take, even if it didn't necessarily make sense. Like, technically, a wizard could take Power Attack. The only requirement in the past used to be that you had a base attack bonus of +1, so they couldn't take it at first level, but they could eventually take it, even though, again, it just didn't make sense for the classes. So in this one, they break it down by the particular class itself. So Power Attack is a feat from the fighter list. And other abilities that, or other feats that we've had from Pathfinder 1st Edition and other similar systems to that, again, have been sort of broken down by the classes that it makes the most sense for. It also makes it so that the classes will feel different from one another. Now, some classes will have similar concepts for their abilities. Like, for example, you've got Power Attack for the fighter, which basically counts as 2 actions, and they make a single attack roll. They deal like double damage. Then you have For example, like the Ranger has a dual weapon attack where I think they make one attack roll, but it's with both weapons or something like that. So I haven't read the Ranger one too closely yet, so don't exactly quote me on that. But there are similar things. Like the Fighter, for example, gets Attack of Opportunity as a class ability. It's not something that everyone gets. There are other classes that have something similar. Like the Paladin has an ability that if someone moves away from them, they can make an attack roll, and it can even interrupt what they're doing. So if they go to attack someone or they move away, then they can use their attack, and if it's enough to down them, then it happens before they would be able to do anything themselves. So just really, really well handled. And the other thing is that, again, it adds a level of customization to your characters. For example, it's very, very unlikely, not impossible, mind you, but it's unlikely that two people completely separate from one another, not really discussing things beforehand, could make two characters of the same ancestry and the same class, and yet have no abilities in common. So they could choose a completely separate ancestry feat, they could choose a completely separate class feat. The only thing that they would have in common would be the things that they gain automatically for being part of that class, like Attack of Opportunity for fighters, for example. So it's a great deal, like I said, of customization, which is something that I actually really like. It also pretty much eliminates a lot of the major feat trees that you used to have before. Something like Whirlwind Attack that used to require like half a dozen or more other feats is something that, you know, just doesn't exist in the same manner. Now, some feats will require that you have, you know, a lower level one to go with. For example, what do we have here? The improved Brutus Shove obviously would require the original version of Brutus Shove. So there are things like that, but they're not nearly as bad as they were before. So again, it's something that I really, really like the way that they handle it, and I consider it to be a strength of the game. Which leads me to my next thing. So number 3 on my list is shields. This is something I've wanted to talk about actually for a little while, and just haven't really had a chance to do it yet, mainly because I just haven't seen it actually in action yet. None of the characters that have been made for the sessions that I've run have really used or relied on shields. But I will say that I think Pathfinder 2nd edition of the Pathfinder Playtest really does something awesome with shields. So the basic thing with shields is, number one, you now have to use an action to raise your shield, which with the 3-action economy that you get in each combat round is perfectly fine. You may, you know, move, attack, and then lift your shield up. It also means that if you wanted to do a full-on attack and make 3 attacks in the same round, then you're just not going to have time to get your shield in place, which is, you know, again, something that makes sense. It's something that you will see in movies, and this feature kind of has a cinematic feel to it, in my opinion. So, in order to actually gain the benefit from your shield to your armor class and your touch armor class, is to use the Raise a Shield action, meaning that by the time you're done your turn, you will need to want to spend one of your actions to actually put your shield in a defensive position. If it's in a defensive position, you not only gain the ability to add its bonuses to your armor class and your touch armor class, but you can also use a special reaction referred to as shield block, which is something that I don't really know of it taking place in too many other RPGs, at least not the ones that I have and I've read. And what the shield block is it basically means that you can let your shield absorb a fair amount of the impact. So when you use the shield block, it does take your reaction, so you do have to have that reaction available for you for the round. So if you use it on, say, if you're a fighter and made an attack of opportunity, you've used your reaction for the round, so you won't be able to use the shield block ability. But if you still have it, then the shield takes a part of the hit. Essentially, it's like a damage reduction based off of the hardness of the shield. Wooden shields obviously aren't able to absorb as much impact as, say, a metal shield would, but you can still have the shield take the hit. What happens is you would subtract the amount of damage equal to the hardness. Let's just say your shield has a hardness of 4. You get hit for 6 damage, your shield takes 4 of it, and the remaining 2 get transferred into you. It's basically, I guess, the equivalent of the amount of force that's applied to your shield arm as you're taking this massive impact off of it. Now, the downside is that your shield gets what's called a dent. Now, 1 dent in an item is generally okay. There may be some items that can only take a single dent before they break, but the shields, you can have it so that it takes, 1 dent and you can still use it normally. However, if you may use it a second time, then your shield suffers a second dent, and most things in the game will be considered broken once they're at 2 dents, which means that you can no longer use the shield to effectively block attacks. Even the Raise a Shield action just won't do anything for you as far as that goes, but you can always repair your shield. If you have the craft skill, for example, during your downtime outside of combats, you can spend an hour, I think it is, to repair your shield, and you basically remove any dents. And which actually brings me to just the breaking items in general, which is something that I think that the system again does pretty well. I don't know too many things that necessarily target items at this point. I'm sure there's something similar to Sunder in this game, I just haven't come across it yet, or certain attacks that may target like a character's armor, for example. Now, if you're wearing armor and it gets broken, you still get some benefits for it. You can still wear the physical suit of armor itself. You just suffer penalties to what the armor would possibly give you. So it could be that you don't gain any benefit from wearing the armor whatsoever, but there's still a chance that the heavier armors you might still get some protection from, even if it's broken. But that aside, I really like the way that they handle shields in this version of the game. You can also attack with shields, though you typically have to put augmentations on the shield to give them blades or stuff like that that you can use, or you can bash them for bludgeoning damage. But I just really think that this system handles shields in one of my favorite ways that I've seen so far. So that was number 3 on my list, so let's move right on to number 2. Alright, so number 2 on my list is the inclusion of resonance points in this game. So resonance points, generally speaking, is a number of points equal to your charisma modifier plus your level. Now the alchemist class can actually change that, and they use their intelligence rather than their charisma, because intelligence is their primary ability score, and they use resonance points for their primary class feature. But in general, I just really like the way that resonance points are introduced into the game. The actual numbers that you get might end up getting a little bit high, but there are certain uses for it that I think sort of offset that, in my opinion. So what are resonance points typically used for? Well, if you're for the alchemist class, for example, when you craft your alchemical items, if you want to do so without having to spend the time and the gold or the resources to do so, you spend a resonance point to create half a batch of your alchemical solutions. Generally though, most classes will use resonance points to invest in magic items or to utilize magic items. So several magic items require that you actually invest in them, which means at the start of your day you have to spend 1 resonance point for every item that you want to be invested into. And you typically invest in things like arms and armor, miscellaneous items, and things like rod, staffs, wands that you actually typically invest into in order to be able to use. Several items will also require that you spend a resonance point in order to actually activate them. It's going to lead into one of the things I want to talk about tomorrow, or maybe not tomorrow, but the next day, in the things that I would like to see sort of changed for the Pathfinder playtest. But in general, I like the fact that it takes, part of your force of will, I guess you could say, or force of personality, to be able to trigger these items. So, for example, a magical wand, you would have to spend a resonance point in order to typically cast a spell out of it. Now, I think if they have a cantrip, for example, that's stored inside of them, then you don't have to spend a resonance point, I think, to use the cantrips. But if you have a wand that produces a magical spell with an actual level number attached to it, then typically you have to spend a resonance point for that. You can also end up investing in some items where you add charges to them, but you would still have to spend resonance points for a lot of those items to continue to use them even beyond that. Now, the thing with resonance is that even if you run out of points, you can still attempt to use things that require you spend a resonance point in them. And the way that they handle this is that if you're out of points and you try to, say, activate a magic item, or if you're an alchemist, you try to use your quick alchemy to cobble something together to use as an alchemical bomb or elixir, you have to make what's called a flat check. And a flat check is a straight d20 roll. And the DC that you have to exceed is equal to 10 plus the number of points that you're overspending or have overspent throughout the day. So the very first time you go to use it, it's the base 10, but because you're trying to overspend by a resonance point, you would add that to the DC. So the starting DC effectively ends up being 11. And it just keeps going up. For the most part, if you simply fail the roll, then it just doesn't activate or it doesn't get used properly. However, in some situations, if you critically fail, which is either rolling a natural 1 on your flat check, or failing the DC by a number like by 10 or greater, then you can't try to overspend for the rest of the day and you have to rest to sort of regain that. So I think it's actually a pretty good system, because again, you're going to be spending several points once you get into higher levels just to fuel your magic items, and then you have to spend a lot of points in order to use your magic items. So it works out rather well, in my opinion. Now, I say this at this point in the game, or this point in the playtest, where I've only gotten up to like 4th level characters, and it hasn't played a huge role in the system as of yet. So it could be that at higher levels, where they're gaining their level plus their charisma modifier, that, you know, maybe they are getting too many points. But from what I've seen so far, and from the basic structure of the system, it's something that I really, really like. And so that was number 2. So, so we're going to move right on to number 1, my favorite thing about the Pathfinder playtest that I've experienced so far. And that is... So number 1 is multi-classing and prestige classing. Those are 2 of the things that really, really made me lose interest in 3rd edition D&D, 3.5 D&D, and ultimately it's something that kind of kept me from really getting into the original Pathfinder, which was essentially an extension of those 2 systems. Multi-classing, even in 5th edition D&D, the current system that's out for that game, is something that I'm just really not a big fan of, and I see it being just overly used and abused to try to min-max characters. I will say that the Pathfinder playtest handles multi-classing and prestige classes in a way that I can very much approve of. So rather than simply saying that I gained a level, so now I'm going to take a level of this class and add all of its abilities, you now have to spend feats in order to be considered sort of multi-class. So the way that they do it is you have an archetype that you get. And in order to multi-class or to use these archetypes, including the prestige ones, you have to spend one of your class's class feats in order to do so. So when you gain a class feat for whatever class that you're in, let's just say you're a fighter and you gain a class feat and you want to multi-class into maybe a cleric, then you can do that by spending your class feat to take the cleric multi-class initial feat. With prestige classes or prestige archetypes, in general, you can only ever have a single prestige tree that you follow. So the first time you take a feat in either multi-class or prestige, you're considered to take a dedication feat. So for example, you have the Cavalier and you have the Cavalier dedication. So that is the dedication feat for that prestige class or that prestige option. With prestige ones, that's the only one that you'd be able to take, so you couldn't take another one afterwards. For example, you couldn't go from a Cavalier to a Pirate. You're pretty much stuck in with what you have. But with your multi-class and stuff, you can take multi-class feats as you go, but there are limitations to that. Now, if you take a prestige class or a prestige archetype, you have to have at least 2 more of these archetype feats before you can take any other type of dedication feat. And I'm not saying prestige archetype dedication feats, but to even multi-class, you'd have to, so if I wanted to be a cavalier, for example, at second level as a fighter, and then I wanted to take cleric later on, I would have to have at least 2 more cavalier feats, archetype feats, before I can take that cleric multi-class dedication feat. And the same applies to multi-class, the multi-class feats as well. The thing is, with multi-class, you can take other classes on top of it later on. So if you go from fighter eventually into cleric, you may decide that you want to pick up a few levels of rogue, and you can do that eventually. However, when you take your first steps into multi-classing by taking the multi-class dedication feat, you cannot select another dedication feat of any type until you have gained 2 more other feats from this archetype. So if you multi-class into a spell casting class, in general, your dedication feat is only going to start you off with cantrips, typically. And then if you want to gain first level spell casting, then you take, the next feat that you would take would be like the basic cleric spell casting, and then you can sort of go on from there. But it's a system that I just think handles multi-classing really, really well, because now you're not getting everything from the class, and you're definitely giving stuff up in order to take it. So it's not a situation where it's like, well, in the past it was, this level of fighter sucks because I don't get anything, so I'm going to take another class altogether instead and, start maybe progressing in that. With this system, you have to give up your class feats in order to take the multi-class feats, and even then what you get for it isn't quite as good as starting off with that full class. So I like the way that this system is handled, and it's something that I would definitely like to see other systems emulate, because I think it just does an excellent job of it overall. So anyway, those were the top 5 things that I like about the Pathfinder playtest so far. So let me know in the comments below what are some of your favorite aspects of the game thus far. And try to save the things that you're not a big fan of yet, because I do plan on doing a video for, I don't know how many things it's going to be at this point. I'm thinking it's either going to be 3 or 5, but I will be talking about some features that I'd like to see adjusted or changed or even potentially added to the game going forward. So anyway, thank you guys once again. I hope you enjoyed the video, and we will see you next time. Take care.